on the House floor about this resolution for about 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, today should not be about politics. I didn't rise to be political. This is personal. A few years ago, I was invited to speak at the UN General Assembly's special session on anti-Semitism. I told the representatives from the assembled countries that anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine, that if there is anti-Semitism in your country, there is hatred that will ultimately permeate throughout society if it is not checked. I never thought I would need to explain that to my colleagues. This is not political. No one should make it political. The use of anti-Semitic language and images can never be tolerated. When a presidential campaign runs a commercial alleging a Jewish global conspiracy in an ad featuring George Soros, Lloyd Blankfein, and Janet Yellen, it is invoking classic anti-Semitic tropes, and it must be condemned. And when the same campaign tweets an image of their opponent featuring a Jewish star and piles of money, it does the same thing, and it must be condemned. And when one of our colleagues accuses Soros, Steyer, and Bloomberg of buying the election, it also invokes classic anti-Semitism. That must be condemned. And when one of our colleagues invokes the classic anti-Semitic tropes, the anti-Semitic language, that Jews control the world, that Jews care only about money, that Jews cannot be loyal Americans if they also support Israel, this too must be condemned. We have the opportunity to condemn all of that, by all of them, intolerable as it all is, by passing a strong condemnation of anti-Semitism. My colleagues, because of anti-Semitism over millennia, millions of Jews have been hated, targeted, expelled from their countries, violently attacked, killed, and exterminated. Words lead to action and to death. There is too much hatred, too many other people who are targeted, and we need to support all of them. But we are having this debate because of the language of one of our colleagues, language that suggests that Jews like me, who serve in the United States in Congress, and whose father earned a Purple Heart fighting the Nazis in the Battle of the Bulge, that we are not loyal Americans? Why are we unable to singularly condemn anti-Semitism? Why can't we call out anti-Semitism and show that we've learned the lessons of history? It feels like we're only able to call the use of anti-Semitic language by a colleague of ours, any colleague of ours, if we're addressing all forms of hatred. And it feels like we can't say it's anti-Semitism unless everyone agrees that it's anti-Semitism. Who gets to define what counts as stereotypes and discrimination? Isn't it the people who experience the bias, the people who have experienced that hatred for thousands of years? If Jews whose families were persecuted or attacked or killed are talking about how anti-Semitic words can lead at their most hateful and violent extremes, then it's anti-Semitism. And take my word for it. If you don't do that, then please understand that an anti-Semite will hear those words as a dog whistle. What's been so difficult for so many people in my community is that people who are fearful when anti-Semitic tropes are used are being told that they're wrong. Jewish elected officials are saying that this history that we know well is invoked by referencing dual loyalty, and some of my colleagues are saying that it doesn't matter what that history means to me. It is intensely personal because it is ongoing. In Europe, in Asia, in the Middle East, in South America, and in the United States. 11 people were killed less than 6 months ago in a synagogue because they're Jews. What's happening in our country should alarm us all. The attacks on our colleagues because they are Muslim or African American or Hispanic or members of the LGBT community, any attack must be condemned when it's based on hatred. But when a colleague invokes classic anti-Semitic lies 3 times, then this body must condemn that anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is worthy of being taken seriously on its own. It's worthy of being singularly called out. Jews control the world. Jews care only about money. Jews have dual loyalty and can't be patriotic members of the country in which they live. Words matter. For generations, they have had dangerous consequences for me, for my family, and for my people. This shouldn't be so hard. I yield back.
Congressman Ted Deutsch is a Democrat from Florida today on the House floor. The House is expected to take up a resolution in response to comments by Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, Democrat from Minnesota. Originally, the resolution was going to condemn anti-Semitism. It has now been broadened, we understand, to also condemn Islamophobia, white supremacy, and other forms of hate. When that debate happens, you can listen to it here on C-SPAN Radio, WCSP-FM, Washington. Up next, we're going to head to the House floor where they're debating a different issue. It's a bill called H.R. 1, symbolically the most important bill for the new House Democratic majority. It's a package of changes to campaign finance, voting rights, and ethics laws. They're dealing with amendments. The amendment on the floor right now would lower the voting age for federal elections to 16. And speaking, Rodney Davis, Republican. Actually, he just finished up, but we do head to the House floor.
He's recognized.
Yes. Okay. Well, we respectfully disagree with one another, and I too appreciate the opportunity to engage in the civil discourse with you. The data supports the fact that by extending the table of democracy, given what we've learned in Maryland,
Democrat Ayanna Pressley is the sponsor of the amendment.
in fact, we have seen a more robust voter participation by those 16 and 17-year-olds than those over the age of 18. I think that we should be cultivating that relationship with young people and their government and their participation as early as possible. And although a constitutional amendment is one approach, I do think that we have a mandate from this electorate as a Congress to be bold, and this is the opportunity to do exactly that, and we should be acting. And there's nothing spontaneous about this. There have been advocates who have been organizing in communities for decades on this very issue, and of course colleagues in this very House.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Madam Speaker, may I inquire how much time I have left?
The gentleman has 3 minutes remaining.
I'd like to yield 1 minute to my good friend from Tennessee, Mr. Green.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Just want to share a thought on this. It's interesting that recently we just raised the alcohol purchasing age to 21. We don't allow a 16-year-old to buy a beer, and the decision making is because of their ability to reason at that age. That's why we moved their ability to buy a simple beer to age 21. And now the other side wants to grant a 16-year-old the ability to decide the future of the country. I think this is foolish. I yield.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Is there no more time?
The Democratic side, no more time.
It's a great debate to have. The problem we have here in this country, many 16-year-olds are still, all 16-year-olds are still legally minors. They can't be tried as adults in the court of law unless under special circumstances of heinous crimes. They can't join the military. They wouldn't even be eligible for the draft that took so many of our young men to Southeast Asia, where many never came home when the last time the voting age was lowered. In some states, 16-year-olds can't even drive their car alone. They can't take out a loan. They can't take out a mortgage. They can't open a credit card. And they can't even run for the offices that we would be asking them to be allowed to vote for. This is an amendment that has political reasons behind it. It's a reason that I believe the Democrats are pushing it. It's because they believe they will be able to increase the number of Democrat votes that are put forth in the next election. This institution should not be used for that. This bill is political enough. This bill as a whole is nothing more than a charade to make permanent the Democratic majority that just came into existence just a few months ago. And that's why I believe H.R. 1 is a bill that should be voted against. Please vote no on H.R. 1, and please vote no on this amendment for the reasons that I put forth. But again, thank you to my colleague from Massachusetts, my colleague from New York, for being here and participating in this process. Now I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Massachusetts. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
I request the yeas and nays.
Does the gentlewoman request a recorded vote?
Yes.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Massachusetts will be postponed.
Live coverage from the House floor. The members working on amendments to H.R. 1, the package of changes to campaign finance, voting, and ethics laws. As you heard, any recorded votes are being postponed, will be taken together later today.
To consider amendment number 25, printed in Part B of House Report 116-16. For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee seek recognition?
Madam Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 25, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-16, offered by Mr. Green of Tennessee.
Pursuant to House Resolution 172, the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Green, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I rise today to offer my amendment expressing the sense of Congress that free speech should be protected. House Resolution 1 is a misguided bill with many problems. One problem in particular has united everyone from the Heritage Foundation to the ACLU. It's the bill's assault on free speech. The ACLU itself says H.R. 1 will, and I quote, chill speech essential to our public discourse, end quote. When the ACLU admonishes a Democrat bill, everyone should take notice. My amendment is simple. It reaffirms the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. The First Amendment, after all, guarantees the most fundamental right of our democratic society. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Our founding fathers knew that in order for the American experiment to work, the people must be free. Free to participate in the democratic process, free to vote in elections, free to help candidates and causes they believe in, and free to speak up when their elected officials are no longer representing them. The freedom of speech enshrined in the First Amendment has helped make America the most exceptional country in the history of the world. Unfortunately, H.R. 1 tramples on that very freedom. I offer this amendment to express the sense of Congress that the freedom of speech must be preserved and protected, because without it, the American experiment won't ever be the same again. A vote against this amendment is a vote against free speech. And if you don't believe me, ask the ACLU. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
To claim the time in opposition.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise in opposition to this amendment reluctantly because it is only the last paragraph in the amendment that causes concern.
Democrat Zoe Lofgren.
The amendment expresses a sense of Congress that free speech should be protected. Who can disagree with that? Our founding fathers envisioned a robust and open discourse. They did not fathom speech that was unaccountable to anonymous corporations that would drown out the voices of individual Americans. The concern we have on this amendment is the last paragraph really is an attempt to protect the Citizens United decision and the flow of unlimited dark money into our politics and elections. You know, it's important to note that under the guise of free speech, some are suggesting that we need to protect anonymous special interests. Now, nothing stops people or entities from donating to political campaigns or politicians, but they must be transparent about it. Justice Brandeis indicated, and I think he's very wise, that sunshine is the best disinfectant, and the American people cannot fully exercise their First Amendment rights if they do not have all the information necessary to react in an informed manner. We all have the right to know who's trying to influence elections, and it may well change our minds if we know who is saying what. ultimately, this amendment is flawed because disclosure does not limit speech. In Citizens United, the court affirmed holdings in other cases that disclaimer and disclosure requirements impose no ceiling on campaign-related activities and do not prevent anyone from speaking. Indeed, the court held that disclosure is, quote, a less restrictive alternative to more comprehensive regulations. Vaunted conservatives have long espoused this principle, and the Supreme Court has repeatedly endorsed disclosure because it helps voters hold elected leaders accountable. In fact, 8 of the 9 Supreme Court justices upheld disclosure in the Citizens United case as necessary for voters to hold leaders accountable. Perhaps no one said it, then Justice Antonin Scalia in Doe v. Reed, and I quote Justice Scalia, requiring people to stand up in public for their political acts fosters civic courage, without which democracy is doomed. Now, much has been said about the ACLU, and I appreciate what the ACLU does on many scores, but they have a storied history of litigating constitutional issues that I support. However, we have differed on our approach to campaign finance laws. They have upheld and supported the Citizens United decision, and they oppose McCain-Feingold. I think while I support so much of the good work they do, they're mistaken on this issue. And I would submit in the record a letter from Democracy 21, which is a rebuttal, a very thoughtful rebuttal to the ACLU's position.
And that request will be covered by General Lee.
And I would note also that we have just received a letter from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights expressing their strong support for H.R. 1, and this is an organization that no one can fault for their firm leadership on human and civil and constitutional rights for many, many decades. So with that, Madam Chairwoman, I would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Madam Chairman, how much time do I have remaining?
The gentleman has 3 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I just want to make a few specific comments in regard to the amendment and how it impacts H.R. 1 in general. First, there are no special interest protections in this amendment, none whatsoever. And I remind my colleagues of what the ACLU actually said about H.R. 1. It places a chill on speech essential to our public discourse.
Republican Mark Green.
I'd like to stress that the Court has long affirmed the rights of individuals and organizations to have free speech. With those comments and clarifications, Madam Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from California.
We have no additional speakers at this point. I would just note that, and I understand the gentleman's points 1 through 4. I completely agree. It's number 5 in your amendment that causes me concern about whether there is actually an undercutting of the H.R. 1's disclosure requirements, and that is the concern we have and why I am so sorry that I cannot support the amendment. I do think that we have a disagreement over disclosure. I don't understand why, because the Supreme Court, including Justice Scalia, recommended that to us, and we never followed up with Justice Scalia's admonition that we should have disclosure as a remedy for a concern over unlimited money. So with that, I would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'd just like to read that point 5. This is what it actually says. Political speech, including the financial contributions to political or issue advocacy campaigns, is a vital part of our nation's free exchange of ideas, and avenues of free expression must be preserved and protected. That's all it says. Let the American people decide. That's essentially what it says. That free speech should be protected. with that, I reserve the remaining.
And reserves, the gentlewoman from California is recognized.
I understand, but the concern that's been expressed to me by a number of people who've read this, probably lawyers who've spent more time on constitutional cases than I have, is that the concern is that this, as a part of the bill, would undercut the disclosure requirements that are established within it. And that is the reason I regret that we cannot come to an agreement, and I guess my time has expired, sir.
The gentleman from Tennessee.
In conclusion, Madam Chairman, I just, again, as I look at that point 5 or paragraph 5, you know, supporting the free exchange of ideas and avenues of free expression, I struggle to see where disclosure issues are raised in that paragraph. But as my colleagues have no one else to comment on the bill, I am ready to yield and have the amendment considered. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Tennessee. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
I request the yeas and nays.
Does the gentleman request a recorded vote?
A recorded vote, yes. Thank you.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Tennessee will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 26, printed in Part B of House Report 11616. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 26, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-16, offered by Mr. Green of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 172, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also thank the gentle yet courageous lady from California for leading this floor discussion, debate, if you will. I thank the Rules Committee for allowing this amendment to be in order. And I also would like to thank my staff for the stellar, outstanding job they've done to help bring this amendment to the floor. Madam Chair, on November 19th of 1863, the 16th President of the United States of America, standing near the battlefield at Gettysburg, proclaimed that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. That's what our bill, H.R. 1, is all about. Government of the people, by the people, for the people. And Madam Chair, you cannot have government of the people, by the people, for the people, without the precious right to vote. The right to vote is something that people have fought for in this country. Dr. King marched for it. John Lewis went to jail for it. The Honorable John Lewis, member of this House. Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney died for it. The right to vote. H.R. 1 is about protecting the right to vote. And this amendment is one that will help us to inculcate new young people into the voting process. The amendment simply allows those who are in high school to receive voter registration information while they are in school on the school campus. It does not, N-O-T, does not change the laws related to registration and qualifications to vote. It merely allows the principal at a school to go to the young people and provide them with voter registration information so that they may decide. It does not, N-O-T, impose upon them a duty to register, but it does give them the opportunity to. This is a good thing in a country where we believe that government of the people, by the people, shall not perish from the earth. With this said, I will yield to the gentleman.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I rise to claim time in opposition, although I'm not opposed to the basis of the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
Well, thank you, and thank you to my colleague, Mr. Green from Texas. I'm not opposed to what this amendment does, although, however, I will point out once again, this is another unfunded mandate. This is another cost that the CBO has already said from what they can score in this bill is going to cost taxpayers $2.8 billion, with potential for billions more for what they couldn't even offer a congressional budget score for. So I have some issues with that, although I appreciate the direction my colleague is going with this. I think providing voter registration materials at schools is something that's probably being done now. I would hope that local county clerks, I know mine are, I would hope that they're already doing that.
Republican Rodney Davis.
I'm not opposed to that language. However, I do believe I disagree with my colleague from Texas that H.R. 1 is a bill by the people and for the people. And frankly, I believe every single American who's eligible to vote should have their vote counted, and they should have their vote protected. We all, as Americans, Republicans and Democrats, want every vote to count. We want to make sure everyone can get registered to vote. And at a time in our country when registration and turnout is exceedingly high compared to previous generations, we're doing that. But make no mistake about it. This bill is not by the people. H.R. 1 is not for the people. H.R. 1 is for the members of Congress who sit in this institution, who are going to eventually get tax dollars to pay for their own campaign ads. That's why this bill is a bad bill. I appreciate the amendment that my colleague is offering, but by no means is H.R. 1 going to ensure that we have the protection to ensure that every eligible American voter has their vote counted and protected. And with that, I'll reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I shall yield such time as the gentlelady from California may consume to her, please.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Democrat Zoe Lofgren.
Thank you, Mr. Green. This is a splendid amendment. It will do a lot to allow young people to channel their excitement and to understand that they are important and they are going to be participating as voters when they turn 18. It works well with the amendment that will be offered by Mr. Neguse later that allows for pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds so that when they turn 18, they will automatically be registered to vote. I know that there is some concern on both sides of the aisle about the idea of a 16-year-old change in the voting eligibility. We don't know how that amendment will turn out, but certainly these amendments would do much to make sure that young people are thoroughly connected to our government and understand that the government belongs to them and their families. And I thank the gentleman for yielding and yield back to Mr. Green.
Close with these words. This is a participatory democracy. If it is to function efficaciously, the right to vote must be protected. Now, I join my colleague on the other side in his position that all votes should be counted and that every person who has a right to vote should be in a position to vote. This bill, this resolution, if you will, this amendment, helps to assure that young people will start to participate in the participatory democracy. I yield back.
Democrat Al Green, live from the House floor.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Well, again, I'd like to thank my colleague and friend from Texas, Mr. Green. Again, I agree with what Chairperson Lofgren said. The excitement of students in high schools being able to understand what it means to be able to register to vote and to participate in the political process. That's why I visit high schools throughout my district on a regular basis each time we're back from Washington off this floor and in our districts for our district work period. And I'm going to, again, extend the olive branch of bipartisanship to ensure that I'm not going to oppose this amendment. I want this amendment to pass through, but I will note to many of my colleagues on the floor, Madam Speaker, that we just had 2 Republican amendments offered and not one passed. The olive of bipartisanship has to work both ways. I'm again reaching out, and I will continue to do so throughout the day, but it is not without frustration that that olive branch has not yet been returned. So with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 27, printed in Part B of House Report 116-16. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 27, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-16, offered by Mr. Grijalva of Arizona.
Pursuant to House Resolution 172, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I urge support for the underlying legislation, H.R. 1, which, in my mind, reaffirms the right to vote and empowers the individual citizen in our democracy and empowers their role in our democracy over the wealthy special interest that has been the trend as of late. And my amendment asked that in the spirit of this bill, which is to protect voting rights, that we protect Americans who opt to vote by mail from unnecessary impediments to voting. Specifically, this amendment requires states to provide voters with opportunity to return ballots at a polling place on Election Day. On its face value, this might not seem like a drastic ask, but it merits consideration given granted efforts by states to shortchange eligible voters from casting their ballot by denying them the right to return the ballot on Election Day. In Arizona, about 228,000 people dropped off their ballots at the polling places on Election Day in November of this general election. A majority of which, I should add, were Republican voters. And the reasons why I believe that my amendment should be supported is to protect the vote-by-mail process. In 2016, 16 states combined showed a combined percentage of greater than 50% of votes cast early by mail or via absentee ballots, including my state of Arizona. As more Americans chose to vote by mail, lawmakers in this chamber should facilitate rather than hinder the right to vote by mail. Voting by mail allows voters to take their time in researching candidates, positions, issues that align with their values and making that very important informed decision on Election Day. That only strengthens our democracy and empowers that individual voter. Voting by mail also allows voters not to be constrained by work, school, family, or other sensitive matters that would hinder their ability to wait at polling places for long periods of time. As you will note, other portions of this legislation outline and address the issue of forcing voters to wait hours to cast their ballots, which is unacceptable. Voting by mail can help reduce these incidents and provide more options that are considerate of a person's lifestyle or their particular needs. Vote by mail helps alleviate under-resourced, consolidated, or distant polling places by having an influx of voters on Election Day. By ensuring that all polling sites accept vote-by-mail ballots on Election Day, voters' confidence in the electoral process, I believe, is upheld. Vote by mail is intended to increase voter participation during non-presidential election years, which tend to have overall lower voter turnout rates. The scope of this legislation is to promote and protect the right to vote of every American citizen, which they are entitled to. For many constituents, voting by mail is the most practical and convenient method to exercise that right. With ongoing efforts at all levels of governance to restrict voting, now more than ever, it is important to ensure that regardless of voting in person or by mail, that vote is cast, processed, tabulated, and accepted as valid. I would hope that you would join me in ensuring states are not able to place harmful restrictions on voters. States should continue to do their due diligence, protect voters by allowing them to return their ballots on election day. Anything less would be a direct attack on voters' rights and their disfranchisement and the disfranchisement of a growing percentage of non-traditional voters in this nation. With that, Madam Speaker, I reserve.
Democrat Raul Grijalva.
Reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to rise and claim time in opposition. Mainly for
recognized.
A couple questions, or one question in particular. If the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva, Chairman Grijalva, would, if he has this information, I'd like to know. This is already the process that we follow in my home state of Illinois.
Republican Rodney Davis.
Are there any states that don't allow this already that you're aware of?
I think there have been efforts in my home state to begin to restrict the use of election day dropping off of vote-by-mail forms and other discussions, and this is both a preventive and an encouraging amendment that says prevent any of those actions, and more importantly, to encourage states to apply that fairly.
Thank you. I'll reclaim my time, but let the record show it is not a process. It's illegal in the state, in my colleague's home state. I'm not against this process happening because it happens in my home state right now. The problem we have, we don't want somebody who's eligible to cast a ballot, who got that vote-by-mail ballot and they decided on election day to fill it out. We want them to be able to go to their polling place and not have to wait in line, and we want them to be able to turn it in. The problem we have on our side of the aisle is it's ballot harvesting. It's a process in North Carolina where a Republican is going to likely go to jail if convicted. But that same process that will likely send that person to jail if convicted is legal in California. We have a problem with somebody besides that voter taking absentee ballots, unwatched, not a bipartisan effort, not any control mechanisms, bringing it to the polling place or to the county clerk on election day or after election day. Those are issues that we're concerned about in the bill. I don't oppose this amendment because, again, it's already the process we follow in my home state. So with that, I'll reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you. And at this point, to the author and leader of the legislation, H.R. 1, yield a minute to my good friend, Mr. Sarbanes.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank the gentleman for yielding. I just want to support this amendment. Again, what we're talking about here with H.R. 1 is increasing confidence, engagement, participation on behalf of the voters, this opportunity to be able to return mail-in ballots at polling places is a way to further that. I also want to say that with respect to this idea, we have to distinguish between election fraud and voter fraud. What we saw in North Carolina was election fraud by political operative taking advantage of voters, not voters engaged in fraud. So there's a very important distinction there. And then I also just really wanted to quickly correct the record for my colleague from the other side of the aisle who mentioned a moment ago that somehow under H.R. 1 taxpayer money would be used to fund candidates' campaigns. Nothing could be further from the truth. The bill provides explicitly that there will be no taxpayer funds going to any kind of candidate committees or candidate campaigns. I just wanted to correct the record. I'm happy to continue doing that over the course of the debate. And with that, I yield my time back. Thank you.
Thank you. And in yielding the remainder of my time, Madam Chair, I would remind everybody that this amendment provides the states with flexibility. It is providing a convenience, as my colleague mentioned, and as a preventive tool, prohibiting voters that no prohibition on voters returning mail ballots would actually occur or slow down the process. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And again, I don't oppose a process that is already in existence in my home state to ensure that every eligible American voter has their vote counted and protected. There are legitimate concerns about ballot harvesting process. Otherwise, somebody might not have to face a trial in North Carolina. I certainly appreciate the author coming to the floor to once again talk about the bill and some of the changes that were made since it was introduced on January 3rd. first day of Congress, co-sponsored by every member of the other side of the aisle, a 571-page bill. I certainly hope everybody had a chance to take a look at that bill before signing their name on the dotted line, because the provision that the author put in place, if he would have reached out to any of the 3 Republicans on the House Administration Committee, we would have gladly discussed some of our priorities, but there was no olive branch of bipartisanship whatsoever. And the sheer fact that somehow the bill has been changed to now create this fine that's going to be corporate malfeasance dollars, that's never going to be able to get the amount of money in that candidates are going to be able to expect when running for Congress. Candidates even like the neo-Nazi who ran against my good friend Dan Lipinski in the last race, that now will be eligible for this corporate malfeasance money. And everybody knows on that side of the aisle, when candidates for Congress, including members of Congress on the other side of the aisle, aren't going to get what they expect into their campaigns from this corporate malfeasance fund, that's corporate dollars that we weren't supposed to be able to take as members of Congress in our campaigns anyway, but now somehow it's a good idea to do. You know what's going to happen? They're going to say, I don't have the money in my campaign to run a race, and they're going to ask the taxpayers to bail it out. Everybody on that side of the aisle knows that is going to happen. And that shell game that they're playing right now is very frustrating. The CBO couldn't even score this new provision. We don't even know how much this is going to cost beyond the possible $3 billion plus. This is a bill designed to keep a Democratic majority in this Congress so that we don't have a chance to preside over these hearings anymore. That's not the way to run elections. That's not what our Constitution wants. That's not what anybody should support. And with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time. And again, I am not opposed to this amendment.
Republican Rodney Davis, live from the House floor.
Yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 28, printed in Part B of House Report 116-16. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I rise today to I have an amendment at the desk, Amendment 28.
Does the gentleman rise as a designee of the gentleman from Florida?
I do.
Very well. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 28. In Part B of House Report number 116-16, offered by Mr. Rodney Davis of Illinois.
Pursuant to House Resolution 172, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. It's great to have many conversations with you today. This is what's great about the institution. Our forefathers set up a legislative branch to debate, to cast votes, and then to legislate. We won't always agree on every issue. There are times we'll vehemently disagree with each other, but as you know, Madam Speaker, after the debate's over, we all move on and look forward to working with each other. Today, I rise in support of Amendment 28 because members of Congress, all of us in the legislative branch, are appropriately held to stringent ethical standards that are designed to prevent financial or material gain for actions taken while we are legislating in this institution. We should ensure all branches of government are held to high ethical standards too. This common sense amendment would require the Judicial Conference of the United States to implement a judicial code that is at least as stringent as the requirements placed on members of Congress. This amendment would be a step in the right direction for providing transparency in government, which the American people expect and deserve. And again, I give the olive branch to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle on the last 2 amendments, and I certainly hope that that olive branch can be returned on this Republican amendment, and I will reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia rise?
I rise to claim opposition to this amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Democrat Hank Johnson.
Is well-intentioned but riddled with inconsistencies that render it ineffective and unnecessary. Although judges should be held to high ethical standards, it is a false equivalence to claim that members of Congress and judges face the same dilemmas. Judges do not accept campaign funds, they do not represent constituents, and have no term limits. Every person who has the privilege to serve in our government should be held to a code of conduct. Yet, it is a misstep to assume that all branches of government have the same prerogatives and ethical pitfalls. H.R. 1 already contains a reasonable approach to expanding ethics for the United States Supreme Court, and this amendment would confuse the clarity and enforcement of these standards. The Judicial Conference of the United States is best suited to issue a code of conduct for the courts of the United States. Judges know best what predicaments judges face and how best to protect the integrity of our courts from corruption and improper conduct. We should pass H.R. 1 without this amendment so that we can create effective, enforceable, ethical standards for our courts. And with that, I will yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my colleague from Georgia for debating this amendment with me. There are a lot of what I believe constitutional issues with H.R. 1. Legislative overreach that defies the equal branches of government. This one does not. All we're simply doing with this amendment is asking the Judicial Conference of the United States to implement a judicial code up and down the judicial spectrum. Maybe it will actually help ensure that as judges go through the confirmation process in the Senate for whatever level of federal judgeship he or she may be nominated for, it might help us understand who these judges are. This is a very common sense amendment. We're not saying Congress is going to legislate judicial conduct. We're just saying we're the lawmakers. Why don't we ask the judges, the Judicial Conference, to do it for the judges? Just like our standards are set by Congress. And the executive branch standards should be set by the executive branch. These are small things that make a big difference in a big bill. And again, I've extended the olive branch of bipartisanship this entire day, yesterday, and I would certainly hope that that would be extended back to us, because we have yet in this entire process of H.R. 1 being a 622-page bill yesterday and added pages upon pages yesterday and today, not one single Republican amendment has been accepted. Not one. Maybe this is it. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 29, printed in Part B of House Report 116-16. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Wisconsin seek recognition?
I rise today to offer an amendment. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 29, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-16, offered by Ms. Moore of Wisconsin.
Pursuant to House Resolution 172, the gentlewoman from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Wisconsin.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I rise today to offer an amendment to H.R. 1 for the People Act, which would, among other provisions, require federal and state governments to physically provide voting registration materials at the same time they provide notification of a restoration of voting rights under the bill. Voting is the most powerful voices that we have in our democracy. As a Wisconsinite, I am proud to stand today to fight for everyone's right to vote. Wisconsin has been the petri dish for some of the most pernicious voting suppression efforts, including partisan gerrymandering, all designed to marginalize some votes. Where our votes are counted, our voices are heard. And I am here to say, no more to suppression. Anyone who works to suppress The vote does not support democracy, Madam Chair. Anyone who limits the ability of all people to express their voice through the ballot does not support democracy. And with that, Madam Chair, I would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois. Or for what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois rise?
Madam Speaker, I rise this time to actually claim time in opposition to this amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
Republican Rodney Davis.
Speaker, I was a strong supporter of the First Step Act, and I continue to support criminal justice reform efforts. And as a matter of fact, just last week, a former czar in the Obama administration, Van Jones, said that, quote, the conservative movement in this country, unfortunately from his point of view, is now the leader on this issue of reform, talking about criminal justice reform. We need to make sure that we don't have petty drug users spending more time in federal prison than Jared the Subway guy who was a pedophile. But we've got to review this amendment very carefully. We still haven't figured out the processes and procedures of an amendment that passed, of part of H.R. 1 that's in the underlying bill that would allow felons to vote without any determination of whether that felon, maybe like Jared the Subway guy, you know, who's to say he doesn't live near a polling place where his polling place is a school? How in the world can we move forward on getting voter registration materials to felons without understanding who's eligible to go to the exact polling place they're supposed to vote at or not? I don't want pedophiles, sex offenders, going into a polling place in many rural areas that the only place they have is a school with children. The provision in the bill needs to be changed, needs to be vetted very carefully. We need to have some certainty here. So I certainly do not support this amendment because I still am not sure that a felon who's not allowed around children won't be forced to cast his or her vote around children. That's why this bill needs to be put back into our committees of jurisdiction, where almost 40% of the jurisdiction was never marked up in the first place. This is a rush. I don't blame my colleagues who are here today. I think Chairperson Lofgren and the members of the House Administration Committee have done an excellent job putting a bill that is terrible forward. But the only reason we're here on the floor this week is because Speaker Pelosi and the Democratic leadership team are forcing this issue. The American people and the American taxpayers aren't going to stand for the provisions that are in this bill. I don't know why we're rushing it, and I certainly wish there was more bipartisanship, and I certainly wish there was clarification on whether or not a former convicted felon who's a sex offender, on whether or not he or she's going to be allowed in a polling place that happens to be a school where they can't go into or can't get within a certain amount of yardage to outside of Election Day. I can't support this amendment, and I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Wisconsin is recognized.
And will the chair tell me how much time I have left?
The gentlelady has 3 3/4 minutes left.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Well, let me commend the gentleman for his active participation in the First Step Back, the criminal justice reform. Let me commend him on his efforts to restore freedom to felons, and as he indicated, murderers and drug dealers and other kinds of criminals, that he worked so hard to restore their right to freedom. This amendment deals with really low-hanging fruit in terms of criminal justice reform. It just says that when the department has decided that someone has finished their term, when they have finished their sentence, that when they are released, that they would simply receive those instructions as to how to register to vote. And if there is a pedophile, I would have welcomed the gentleman's amendment, and perhaps he can be part of the rules, to say that you must vote by absentee. I'll yield to the gentlelady, the chairwoman of the committee.
I thank the gentlelady.
Democrat Gwen Moore yielding to Democrat Zoe Lofgren.
Nothing in H.R. 1 impacts any state law that requires an individual who's been convicted of an offense against a child from staying away from a school. Luckily, we have vote by mail and early voting at county facilities in the bill, so that is really not a real issue, and I thank the gentlelady for yielding.
And thank you so much, Madam Chair, for that clarification. You know, democracy demands hard work. And again, I commend the gentleman for his hard work to put criminals back onto the street. This is very low-hanging fruit. There have been studies that have indicated that restoring the voting rights of felons really means that they'll be more likely to not reoffend because we are bringing them back into the civil discourse of our communities. And I reserve the right to have the last word. So is the gentleman done talking?
Gentlewoman from Wisconsin reserves. The gentleman from Illinois has the right to close. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Well, I certainly wish that the underlying piece of legislation actually addressed our concerns, which is why I would urge both sides of the aisle to send this back to committee to ensure that while it doesn't specifically say that state laws can't be followed when it comes to allowing sex offenders into polling places, it also doesn't prevent it. That's the problem with this top-down overreach. There's nothing in this bill, in H.R. 1, that would prevent sex offenders from walking in and demanding his or her right to vote while surrounded by children that he or she are not allowed around because of a previous conviction or sex offender registration status. And I appreciate my colleague from Wisconsin's work on the First Step Act also, and I also have to offer a correction. You know, the First Step Act was actually to get nonviolent offenders out of our prisons, the petty drug users who've been put away because maybe he or she didn't have the information that the assistant U.S. attorney wanted, and all of a sudden they're ratcheted into a long jail sentence because of mandatory minimums. These are the issues that had bipartisanship. By no means does the First Step Act or any act of criminal justice reform that I support or that anybody else that I know would support would want murderers out of prison. That's not the case. If that's the case, we have some more questions about this amendment. We have some more questions about this bill. We want to make sure those jail cells are reserved for the people who are the most hardened criminals. We got to work together on criminal justice reform to take the next step in the First Step Act. We need to make it better, but it's all for nonviolent offenders. But I have some serious concerns when sex offenders get out of prison, or maybe they don't even go to prison for that long, like Jared, the Subway guy, because he may have had a lot of money, may have had the ability to hire a good lawyer. But so many petty drug offenders that are going to be the beneficiary of the First Step Act did.
Time has expired.
So
the gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from Wisconsin is recognized.
And thank you. Just in closing, I hope that my colleagues will support this amendment. It doesn't deal with murderers or pedophiles. It deals with people who are coming out of prison and being notified of their rights and responsibilities with regard to voting. And with that, Madam Chair, I would yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Wisconsin. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Pursuant to clause, it is now in order to consider amendment number 30, printed in Part B of House Report 116-16. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Wisconsin seek recognition?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 30, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-16, offered by Ms. Moore of Wisconsin.
Pursuant to House Resolution 172, the gentlewoman from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Wisconsin.
Well, thank you again, Madam Chair. My amendment simply requires an ongoing evaluation after every federal election of the efforts to ensure that those with disabilities have successfully been able to exercise their right to vote. The Government Accountability Office would be charged with assessing polling place accessibility, privacy issues, and the extent of poll worker training on the rights of individuals with disabilities, as well as on accessible voting machines, among other identified barriers. They would provide their recommendations, if any, to Congress. I recently had a constituent come into my office and speak about the continued challenges faced by those with disabilities when it comes to exercising this fundamental right, such as inaccessible voting machines that were located and situated as to not provide privacy for the voter. And this is not just an anecdotal evidence of a problem. According to the National Council on Independent Living, over 2 million people with disabilities didn't vote in 2016. And this isn't just an issue of voter apathy. Study after study shows that our voting system is still inaccessible. What we know is that even with laws in place, not all polling places are accessible because of physical barriers, unprepared and untrained staff, or accessible equipment that's either not functional or turned off. Let me be clear. This bill takes steps forward to address those barriers, and I appreciate the addition of those measures. And I reserve the balance of my time.
The woman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I rise to claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized.
Republican Rodney Davis, live from the House floor.
Madam Speaker, but I am not opposed to this amendment. I think we should work together to ensure that all those who have disabilities have access to be able to cast their vote. And I know my home state of Illinois is doing yeoman's work to ensure, our local county clerks are doing yeoman's work to ensure that all those who need reasonable accommodations get them. So I thank the gentlelady from Wisconsin for offering it. But before I reserve, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to my friend from Montana, Mr. Gianforte.
The gentleman from Montana is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding the time. We all agree that Americans should vote and participate in our republic. We all agree that Americans' vote deserves to be counted and protected. But the underlying bill we consider today is riddled with problems. My friends across the aisle call this bill the For the People's Act, but it should really be called the Protect Professional Politicians Act. One of the most egregious parts of this bill is the creation of federal funding for elections. Taxpayers will pay for politicians' campaigns, whether they agree with them or not. Under this bill, if someone gives a politician $200, the federal government will send $1,200 of money to that politician. Those mailers that fill your mailbox, well, under the Protect the Professional Politicians Act, you'll pay for them. Those attack ads that flood your TV, well, you'll pay for them. Those high-priced political consultants in Washington, D.C., well, you'll pay for them too. Since when is it a good idea to have taxpayers' hard-earned money shoveled into a trough for a politician's campaign? Montanans don't want that. At a recent town hall, 97% of Montanans told me they oppose taxpayer funding for political campaigns. Imagine Republicans and Democrats working together on a bipartisan bill that addresses voting and election reforms. We could have done that. We did that with election security in the last Congress. But that's not what happened with H.R. 1, the Protect Professional Politicians Act. Maybe that's one of the reasons why diverse groups like the Montana Chamber of Commerce and the ACLU have opposed this bill. I join those groups, and I strongly urge a no vote on H.R. 1, the Protect Professional Politicians Act. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Wisconsin.
Can the chairwoman inform me about the time available to both of us?
Gentlewoman from Wisconsin has 3 minutes remaining. Gentleman from Illinois has 2.5 minutes remaining.
All right.
The gentlewoman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Right. I would be very happy to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarvain.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just want to support the amendment. Obviously, we want to make voting as accessible as we can to everybody, and this is a very, very important step in terms of supporting that with respect to people with disabilities. So I want to thank my colleague for introducing the amendment. I did also just want to correct the record. The last speaker, who may not have been here a few minutes ago, was suggesting that under H.R. 1, taxpayer money would go to fund political campaigns, candidates' campaigns, and I just want to reiterate that the bill is explicit that that would not happen. There will be no taxpayer funds used to support candidates' campaigns. We've provided for that. We've come up with another way to support the matching fund that we want to see, to lift up small donors out there and give them a voice in their own democracy. So I know the gentleman who spoke a moment ago might not have been here previously, so I just wanted to make sure I got that on the record. With that, I yield back. Thank you very much for your amendment.
And I reserve, Madam Chair.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And again, thank you to my colleague from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore. And I'm going to ensure that we have no opposition over here. But I do have a problem with the bill, and I appreciate the author of the bill being here. If I had that much time dedicated to authoring a 571-page bill with the help of outside special interest groups that were commended at the opening press conference, I'd be here to defend it too. But there are so many problems, so many unanswered questions. The sheer fact that the shell game of corporate fines is supposed to fund upwards of billions of dollars to congressional campaigns. My district alone would have been eligible for $6 million plus just by using the last campaign. Multiply that times 435 and add some extra candidates in there, like the neo-Nazi candidate who would be eligible for this funding, who ran against Democrat Dan Lipinski. You know, these are issues that we don't have questions answered because the CBO hasn't scored. CBO has already said $2+ billion for sure, possibly another billion to the taxpayers under this fund. But
Republican Rodney Davis.
How much is going to be raised from this corporate malfeasance? And I have, until this day, until this week, I had no idea that the Democratic majority is okay with putting more corporate money into their own campaign coffers. Corporate dollars are not allowed in our campaigns now, as you know, Madam Speaker. But we're going to use corporate fines at a level we don't know what it amounts to. We're going to use those to fill campaign coffers of members of Congress? Seriously. That's why the bill needs to go back to committee. I'd love to work with the author. I'm one of the most bipartisan members of Congress, according to the Lugar Center, but I never got a call. Would love to help write this bill. We tried to make the bill better. This is another olive branch to the other side on an amendment. I'm going to continue to show bipartisanship that has yet to be reciprocated from the author and from the committee, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Wisconsin is
Well, thank you so much, Madam Chair, and I just want to thank the gentleman again for his support of this amendment.
Democrat Gwen Moore.
I think that America's motto, E pluribus unum, out of many one, will really be honored by this reporting requirement, which I believe will provide information that will move us closer to an election process that is truly inclusive and accessible for all Americans. That's what makes democracy work. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of my time and urge a yes vote on my amendment.
The gentlewoman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Wisconsin. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 31, printed in Part B of House Report 116-16. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Madam Chairwoman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 31, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-16, offered by Mr. Davidson of Ohio.
Pursuant to House Resolution 172, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. All too often in Washington, we mistake activity for progress. And in many cases, we apply that misguided framework onto the states. There are few better examples of this than Washington's dabbling in our election laws over the last 2 or 3 decades. The National Voter Registration Act, our last big partisan bill aimed at increasing turnout, did not actually achieve that aim. It increased voter registration, but as the Congressional Research Service has said, its effect on turnout remains unclear. Its costs and mandates on the states, however, were very clear. That's exactly what I'm talking about in terms of mistaking activity for progress. The centerpiece of Division A's voting section is automatic registration. According to my colleagues on the other side, it covers all sorts of problems, updating the voter rolls, lack of participation, etc. No excuse, vote by mail, same-day registration can be important, but is the automatic voter registration section that is hoped for the driver of participation? This is an aggressive mandate in a bill full of aggressive mandates. 15 states and Washington, D.C. have automatic registration. Only 5 states do it at every welfare and government agency. 3 states require registrants to decline by postcard. This bill would more or less include all 3 of these provisions. This bill would also require the automatic registration of, or pre-registration of 16-year-olds. If it went into law, it would amount to, at the very least, a top 3 most aggressive automatic registration program all across the country. But the bill says that if you're in a state where you've already got automatic registration program on the books, you don't have to comply with all the mandates in the bill. My amendment would do the same thing, but for outcomes instead of for registration. The outcome of this bill is the bill looks for turnout. States that have seen massive increases in turnout should get rewarded, and that's what this amendment does. It lets states who have achieved increased turnout be rewarded by exemption from the mandates in this bill to continue the success that they've been able to achieve with their own programs. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. Does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
To claim the time in opposition.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Democrat Zoe Lofgren, WCSPFM, Washington.
I yield myself such time as I may consume. This amendment aims to exempt states that have taken measures to increase voter turnout that are not subject to additional federal voter registration mandates. And I think what it really does is undermine the progress that would be made under H.R. 1. In November of 2016, the general election, nearly 1 in 5 people who were eligible to vote but who did not vote cited registration issues as their main reason for not casting a ballot. H.R. 1 sets a national standard for voter registration and access to the ballot in federal elections. Now, an improvement in participation rates is fine, but it doesn't mean that proven programs, such as the automatic voter registration program, aren't necessary. The automatic voter registration is not simply to increase turnout. It serves a more fundamental purpose to protect the right to vote by removing bureaucracy and obstacles from the process of registering to vote. Now, nearly every state that's implemented automatic voter registration has seen dramatically increased registration rates. High rates of voter registration are inherently healthy for a democracy. I would just like to ask unanimous consent to put into the record a letter I received just yesterday from Kate Brown, the governor of Oregon. And she notes that Oregon was the first state to have automatic voter registration, went into effect in 2015, and it's added nearly 400,000 voters to the state rolls. has ensured nearly 90% of eligible voters are in fact registered to vote. What that means is they can participate in our election, which I think is very important. So with that, I would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman's request will be covered under general leave. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. The amendment that I've offered is in keeping with the spirit of the bill. States are balancing the right of everyone to have access to the polls. Automatic voter registration has allowed so much access to the polls that it's created challenges for states to be able to comply with even people who are only supposed to vote legally. They have access to voter registration through motor voter and other ways when they're not even residents of the United States. And it puts burdens on states to comply with that. This would be a one-size-fits-all mandate from the federal government that may be needed in some states where access has been challenging and where voter turnout has been low. But in states that have had high voter turnout, that do have effective regimes where you have not just access, but you have participation at levels that have increased by 5% or more, to continue on the path of success that they've had without disruption from federal mandates that would potentially do that. The Brennan Center says, and I'm quoting, automatic voter registration is gaining momentum across the country. Currently, 15 states have approved and DC have approved the policy, meaning that over a third of Americans live in a jurisdiction that has either passed or implemented automatic voter registration. This policy is winning at the state level, and overall push for turnout is also winning. My amendment is complementary to this bill's enterprise, and it would do nothing to undermine the pushes that are already going on at the state level. It was Madison who said that the states are, quote, best acquainted with the situation of their people. I reserve.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized.
I appreciate the spirit in which this amendment is offered, but I disagree. You know, this is about federal elections. The Constitution says the Congress has the ability to promulgate laws about federal elections. And the reason why we're looking at it is there have been states who've gone into AVR. They're grandfathered in the bill. But the problematic states are those states that are trying to suppress the vote, trying to keep people from voting. And we need to do something about that. While we're here, I do want to say something about not your comments, but the prior comments of the ranking member about the cost of the bill. You know, we have a score from CBO, and almost all the money that CBO has scored goes to grants to the states to upgrade their computer systems. $1.5 billion from 2019 to 2024, $750 for other computer assistance, and the other big amount is for making polling places accessible to disabled voters. So it's not about the other provisions in the bill. I would also like to note, and I put this into the record yesterday, the Joint Committee on Taxation has estimated that the fine and forfeiture fund that will go into the Freedom from Influence Fund is estimated to raise $1.948 billion between 2019 and 2029. They also estimate that it will reduce the deficit by $83 million, which is interesting because it will deter people from cheating on their taxes. So the comments made about the money were simply incorrect. And I would like, I know that the Joint Committee on Taxation material is in the record under general leave. We'll make sure that the CBO report is also included. I'll just end with this. I appreciate the tone of the gentleman's arguments and the intent of his amendment, but I do think it severely undercuts the advances that H.R. 1 would make. I urge a no vote, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Ohio. Those in favor say aye. Those who oppose say no. In the opinion of the chair, In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Amendment is not agreed to.
Congresswoman Deborah Haaland in the chair. Live coverage from the House floor. Members debating amendments to H.R. 1, package of changes to campaign finance, voting, and ethics laws. A quick scheduling update at 3:15 p.m. Eastern. The House will turn to a different issue, a resolution condemning anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred. This after comments from Congresswoman Ilhan Omar critical of Israel. Again, that's live at 3:15 p.m. Eastern. Listen live here on C-SPAN Radio.
It is now in order to consider amendment number 32, printed in Part B of House Report 116-16. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 32, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-16, offered by Mr. Davidson of Ohio.
Pursuant to House Resolution 172, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I want to quote from a speech delivered by a former SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission chair. Certain mandates which invoke the Securities and Exchange Commission's mandatory disclosures powers seem more directed at exerting societal pressure on companies to change behavior rather than to disclose financial information that primarily informs investment decisions. That is not to say that the goals of such mandates are not laudable. Indeed, most are. Seeking to improve safety in mines for workers or to end horrible human rights atrocities in the Democratic Republic of the Congo are compelling objectives which, as a citizen, I wholeheartedly share. But as chair of the SEC, I must question as a policy matter, using the federal securities laws and the SEC's powers of mandatory disclosure to accomplish these goals. Those are the words of Mary Jo White, President Obama's SEC chair. She understood what this body understood when it adopted the rider in the provisions in the appropriations bill my amendment seeks to protect. The SEC cannot and should not be used as a tool for social engineering. The disclosure laws cannot be used as a method to compel non-economic behavior. The SEC has known this since the 1970s, when it received hundreds of different petitions to add dozens of different disclosure requirements. It stated at the time, quote, "The Commission's experience over the years in proposing and framing disclosure requirements has not led to question the basic decision of the Congress that insofar as investing is concerned, the primary interest of investors is economic. After all, principal, if not the only reason why people invest their money in securities is to obtain a return. A variety of other motives is probably present in the investment decision of numerous investors, but the only common thread is the hope for a satisfactory return. And it is to this that a disclosure scheme intended to be useful to all must be primarily addressed. We don't know what each individual investor wants. Disclosure requirements have proven very costly, and I urge my colleagues to support the position of the Obama SEC chair and the SEC since the 1970s, which my amendment seeks to preserve. I reserve.
The gentleman reserved. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I rise to claim the time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Democrat Andy Levin.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in opposition to Amendment number 32, which represents an unfortunate attempt to protect the influence of dark corporate money in politics. I'm so proud of the package of bills included in H.R. 1 because I believe that the work we are doing here will transform our democracy. One of the bills included in H.R. 1 is my Transparency in Corporate Political Spending Act, which will reverse a law that prevents the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, from requiring corporations to disclose political spending to their shareholders. The only reason that the law my measure will reverse is even on the books is that for years, conservatives in Congress have misused the appropriations process to enact anti-transparency measures contrary to our most fundamental democratic values. This amendment would keep that anti-transparency law in place, and I cannot for the life of me understand why my colleagues on the other side of the aisle seem so keen on helping corporations keep their political spending a secret. How is that good for our democracy? Indeed, Justice Scalia, in another case after Citizens United, wrote, "Requiring people to stand up in public for their political acts fosters civic courage, without which democracy is doomed." This situation could not be simpler. Americans deserve to know which corporate interests are donating money to influence our elected officials. Corporations should play by the same rules as Michiganders in my district, in Macomb and Oakland counties, and the rest of Americans play by, and disclose their political contributions, because secret corporate spending poses a threat to our democracy and to investor confidence. Since the disastrous decision in the Citizens United versus FEC case allowed corporations to make unlimited political contributions, investors and citizens concerned about the future of American democracy have looked to the SEC to require corporate disclosure of political spending. We need to untie the hands of the SEC so that it can move forward with finalizing a crucial rule requiring corporations simply to disclose their political spending. Requiring public corporations to be honest with their shareholders, customers, and the public about the political donations they make is essential to taking our democracy back from the hands of special interests. This is why I rise in vehement opposition to this amendment, and I urge my colleagues to oppose it as well. Thank you, and I reserve the remainder of my time.
Gentleman reserved. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Madam Chairwoman, companies are already going ahead and disclosing political donations. 196 of the Fortune 500 companies have disclosure policies in place, up from 174 in 2015. More companies are deciding this is the right way to approach their political giving. But I don't have anything to say against their voluntary decision. I do think it's a mistake to force compliance through disclosure laws at a time when public markets are less attractive than ever for going public. Capital formation in the United States of America could easily be improved and has in fact suffered by a heavy-handed regulatory approach, and corporations are not treated differently than individuals are. There's nothing that compels an individual to disclose every single dollar they donate and to whom, and this would go in the other way. If you decide to go public in the United States, you're treated differently under the law than a private company or a private individual. The reality is, under law, you should be treated the same way, and in some cases you're allowed to give a donation privately, in other cases you're not. And corporations have to comply with that law. The Federal Election Commission administers that law, not the Securities and Exchange Commission. And I reserve.
Republican Warren Davidson.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Madam Chairwoman, how much time do I have remaining?
2 1/4 minutes.
Thank you. Madam Chairwoman, I am glad to hear that some corporations are good citizens. However, we cannot leave our basic functioning of our democracy to the whims of individuals. Some corporations protected their safety of their workers before we had the OSHA laws. Some corporations didn't use child labor before we had our child labor laws. We need fundamental rules to make sure there's sunshine in this area. And now I'd like to yield to the gentleman from Maryland, my friend, Mr. Sarbanes.
For how much time does
the gentleman can have the remainder of my time.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. I just really wanted to echo what was just said, a couple of things that were said. First off, to note that clearly best practices have emerged with respect to public companies making this kind of information available, but if that best practice has merit, then it ought to be applied across the board, which is the argument that we are making. I want to thank you for your work and interest in this issue. The SEC is there to protect shareholders. It's there to protect the public. That's the purpose of that agency. And within the basket of things and measures that it can do to protect the public is to promote this kind of disclosure. The rider that we're trying to get rid of in this bill that you would strike, that rider is preventing that kind of inquiry and disclosure and protection of the public to occur. And that's why it's so important that rider be struck. And I agree with the gentleman in his opposition to this amendment. I yield back my time.
For
yes,
a quick discussion, I think, there's been a lot of talk about transparency today. We've had a transparent process, committees, 15 hours of hearing, but this repeals a rider that was privately put on an appropriations bill by Republicans to prevent the SEC from doing something that they want to do. So let's get real. I mean, this actually just undoes a secret rider on an appropriations bill. This is the way bad law gets made. We are here in the middle of the day, in public, debating amendments, not secretly putting little riders on appropriations bills to hamstrung the SEC for making sure that there's sunlight on what corporations are doing. And I thank the gentleman for yielding and yield back.
Democrat Zoe Lofgren.
The gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Ohio.
May I ask how much time I have remaining?
1.5 minutes.
Thank you. I wonder, Madam Chairwoman, whether folks in support or opposed to my amendment would be in favor of requiring every single person and corporation to disclose every dollar that they give. That's essentially what you're saying here. We want to treat publicly traded companies differently than we want to treat every other company and every other individual. And we realize that the FEC isn't competent or qualified to do that job, so we want to add another agency to do this. When President Obama's own chair of the SEC stated, when disclosure gets too complicated or strays from its core purposes, it can lead to information overload, a phenomenon in which ever-increasing amounts of disclosure make it difficult for investors to focus on the information that is material and most relevant to their decision-making as investors in financial markets. As has been stated, the fiduciary responsibility of the directors of the company, of the shareholders, of the people making investments is a common denominator. There may be disparate political views, and these days there surely are. And unpopular positions may sometimes be at odds with the fiduciary responsibilities of companies. This should have been debated in the Financial Services Committee. One of the other flaws of this path that we're on today, subrogating all of the authority of the other committees, with only a handful of amount of participation. And lastly, I would say that a majority of Democrats actually voted for the appropriations bill with the riders that are at the heart of the opposition's objection to my amendment. I yield.
The gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Ohio. Those in favor say aye. Those who oppose say no. Those who oppose say no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed.
Madam Chair, I ask for the yeas and nays. Recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Ohio will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 33, printed in Part B of House Report 116-16. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Madam Chairwoman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 33, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-16, offered by Mr. Davidson of Ohio.
Pursuant to the House Resolution 172, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. My amendment would uphold an appropriations policy rider included in the FY 2019 appropriations package that this body, on a bipartisan basis, just voted on last month. That provision prevents the IRS from the collection of donor information for 501c4 social welfare organizations. In 2013, when the IRS attempted to issue rules that would clamp down on these organizations, there was a bipartisan pushback from groups as disparate as the ACLU to the Tea Party Patriots. The IRS has a poor track record on handling donor information of these organizations. The 2013 IRS scandal targeting conservative groups is a perfect example. The IRS asked groups excruciatingly detailed questions, even as far as details of their prayer meetings for pro-life organizations. Government agencies investigating the intimate details of an organization's efforts to participate in issue advocacy creates an unconstitutional, chilling effect on speech. The IRS is a tax collection agency, not an arbiter of the fitness of an organization's political viewpoint. My amendment is about the fundamental First Amendment rights for citizens and groups to participate in public discourse. Finally, H.R. 1 needlessly removes bipartisan policy rider. It does not make sense in the context of this bill's inclusion of the Disclose Act. I oppose the First Amendment privacy issues raised by the Disclose Act provisions, like the ACLU opposes the Disclose Act. But duplicative collection of information, especially through a scandal-ridden agency like the IRS, which has scandalously overstepped its bounds and authority and jurisdiction, highlight what this amendment is all about, that it is inappropriate for the IRS to collect this sort of information. It is my hope that we can maintain the well-considered appropriations rider already included in the package passed just last month. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves.
Madam Chair, I claim the time in opposition.
Purposed as a gentleman from Colorado.
Madam Chair, I claim the time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chairwoman, I rise today in opposition to the amendment. This amendment would strike a critical provision of H.R. 1 that cracks down on organizations that are flooding our elections with dark money. In the 2018 cycle, $150 million was spent by groups that did not have to disclose their donors. Voters had no idea who was spending this money to influence their vote. What it does is create a system in Washington that leaves elected officials beholden to mega donors rather than the needs of their constituents. This is a direct threat to our democracy, and it is coming from within this chamber. This is a problem that is only getting worse. Since Citizens United dark money spending has gone up by more than 8,000%. Part of the problem is the law isn't being enforced. Some so-called social welfare organizations are devoting too much of their time to political activity, and yet they are allowed a tax-exempt status and don't have to disclose their donors. And the IRS can't do anything about it. We must allow the IRS to move forward on their 2013 rule to define acceptable levels of political activity by these organizations.
Democrat Jason Crow.
Create a clear standard. If a group violates the standard and it fails to adhere to its social welfare mission, then it should lose its tax-exempt status and it should register as a PAC. If you are going to spend millions of dollars to influence someone's vote, then you better have the courage to stand behind your words. Instead, mega donors have taken advantage of a loophole that allows them to donate to tax-exempt welfare organizations while hiding their identities. All Americans should care about the abuse of social welfare organizations. It undermines the sanctity of so many other valuable and necessary organizations. So let's be clear about what's happening here. This amendment serves one purpose: to hide mega donor support for campaigns. So let's pull back the curtain and let Americans see who is really behind those negative ads. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I reserve the remainder of my time.
The gentleman reserves. Recognizes the gentleman from Ohio.
May I inquire the amount of time remaining?
3 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Even the scandal-ridden 2013 era IRS that targeted conservative groups, overstepping their jurisdiction by trying to shape the speech and conduct of the organization rather than collect their taxes, withdrew the rulemaking process that's at the heart of what is sought in this H.R. 1 bill. It is a chilling effect. As we talk about one of our rights to access to the ballot box at the federal level, and we consider that, I think it's important to remember the founding principles that led to the creation of this country. And they're enshrined in the Federalist Papers. I would ask unanimous consent to submit a copy of Federalist 59, wherein Madison makes the case that Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution is about the federal government's right to defend itself. It is not about Congress being the prime driver of elections. And even in the case where, if we look at in the heart of this bill, so I ask unanimous consent to submit.
Requests will be covered under general leave.
Thank you. And as you look at this, we have the Federal Elections Commission. We have bodies of law that require disclosure, and we have organizations that sometimes violate those disclosure laws. And those companies are prosecuted when they do that. Here we want to take and add the IRS responsibility of shaping that disclosure, and only for these type of groups and these type of donations. It is intended to have a chilling effect on speech, and that is at the core of the objection for groups that don't agree on much between the ACLU and the NRA. They don't often agree, but they agree that H.R. 1 is bad, and this is one of the goes to the heart of their objection, and I ask unanimous support for my amendment. And I reserve the balance.
Republican Warren Davidson, live from the House floor.
Gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Madam Chairwoman, I yield a minute to my colleague, Ms. Lofgren.
Just to note, Congress never intended for 501c for social welfare organizations to just be conduits for dark campaign spending. In exchange for nonprofit status and tax-exempt status, the law requires them to engage exclusively in the promotion of social welfare. Now, how is that defined? The IRS was trying to give a bright line on that, but they were stopped by a secret rider put in an appropriations bill. Obviously, the appropriations bill, writ large, got votes from both sides of the aisle because you need to keep the government down. But that's not the way you legislate. That's a sneaky way to change the law. To repeal this provision of H.R. 1 would be a huge mistake, because what we're doing is setting things right so that people know what they can do and what they can't do. Yes, you can speak, but don't expect to get a tax break because you're speaking about politics. You get a tax break because you're doing charitable work. I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Madam Chair, I yield a minute. Madam Chair, I yield a minute to my colleague, Mr. Sarbanes.
Maryland is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank him for his work in introducing the bill that would repeal this rider that prevents the IRS from the kind of inquiry that should be done. This is about figuring out who's leaning in to the big money game. So it goes with a number of other riders that we've seen that have been put in place over the last few years. We want to know if federal contractors are leaning in to the big money game. That's why we want